became king, the people were hoping for a relaxation in some of this taxation of Solomon. And he basically let them know that, no, no, you think it was bad before, it's going to get worse now. And there was a rebellion, and Israel divided into two nations. And in the north were what we call the 10 tribes of Israel. They called themselves Israel. And in the south was Judah and Benjamin, two of the tribes. There were 12, 10 in the north, 10 tribes, and they called themselves Israel. They took the name, you know, it's kind of like a divorce. They took the name, and in the south they had, what they had was Jerusalem. They had the temple. So they each had something. The north had the name, the south had the temple. They had Jerusalem. And so what we're talking about now is the king in the northern part that called itself Israel. And there was a lot of hostility between the two of them. Part of the hostility was because in the north they didn't have, in the nation they called themselves Israel, the 10 tribes, they didn't have Jerusalem, they didn't have the official temple. But they made their own temple. And that infuriated the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. That's why there was a lot of hostility between, in the north they put their capital in Samaria. And those became the people whose descendants became the Samaritans that we read about in the Gospel. So we're in the north now, in Israel. It says, Moab rebelled against Israel after the death of Ahab. And Ahaziah, he's the king after Ahab, he fell down through a lattice in his upper chamber that was in Samaria and was sick. I don't know if his lattice is like lattices I've seen in the garden, but I don't think he had any business walking on it if it's anything like I've got in my garden. But anyway, he fell through the lattice, and he was sick, and he sent messengers and said to them, listen to this now. This gives you an idea of whether this is a good king or a bad king. He sent messengers and said to them, go inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover from this disease. And in my Bible, there's a little number 1 by Beelzebub. And in the margin it says that word translates as Lord of the Flies. So that doesn't sound very good. He is sending messengers and said, go ask the Lord of the Flies, the god of Ekron, whether I will recover. Now that doesn't sound like a very godly thing to do, does it? Go ask the Lord of the Flies. That doesn't even sound like anybody I'd want to have anything to do with anyway. God of Ekron, whether I shall recover this disease. But the angel of the Lord said to Elijah the Tishbite, he's the prophet of God, arise, go to meet the messengers of the king of Samaria, and say to them, is it not because there is not a God in Israel that you go inquire Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? That's a good point. It makes a good point. Is it because there's no God in Israel you're going to ask this Lord of the Flies a question? Verse 4. Now, therefore, thus saith the Lord, thou shalt not come down from that bed on which thou art gone up, but shalt surely die. So it's like you're going to go ask the Lord of the Flies, but I'll give you some free information. I'll tell you for free. You don't have to go ask the Lord of the Flies. I'll tell you, no, you're not going to recover. That's the message. And Elijah departed. See, he told the messengers this. In verse 5. When the messengers turned back unto him, he said to them, why are you now turned back? I guess they got back right away. He sent them out. Elijah met them, told them, here's some free information. You don't have to go all the way to Ekron. Sent them back, and the king said, what are you doing back so soon? Verse 6. They said to him, there came a man to meet us, and said to us, go, turn again unto the king that sent you, and say to him, thus saith the Lord, is it not because there is not a God in Israel, that thou sendest to inquire Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore thou shalt not come down from that bed on which thou art gone up, but shalt surely die. That's their report. They told it just about right. Verse 7. He, that's the king, he said to them, what manner of man was he that came up to meet you, and told you these words? And they answered and said, he was a hairy man. That's a funny image. He was a hairy man, and girt with a girdle of leather about his loins. And he said, it's Elijah the Tishbite. He recognized him by that description. So, oh yeah, I know who it is. So now, let's just stop right there. You got the story so far. Here's this king, not necessarily the best, most godly king, because he's inquiring of the god of Ekron about his problems. And then Elijah meets him and says, don't even bother doing what the king told you. Just turn back and go tell that king he's going to die. Thus saith the Lord. And he said, who was it? Well, here's how he looked. As a hairy man. That was Elijah the Tishbite. Now, do you imagine the king is pleased with this word from the Lord, or do you imagine he's a little bit annoyed? Well, it's easy to understand. He was a little bit put out, probably a little bit angry. But let's just read and we'll find out. Then the king sent him a captain of 50. See, the thing about being a king is you can boss all these people around. And so he's got a captain of 50 soldiers with his 50. And the king sent unto him, that is to Elijah, a captain of 50 with his 50. And he went up to him, that is Elijah, and behold, he sat on top of a hill. And he spoke to him and said, Thou man of God, the king said, Come down. See, the captain of the 50, right? 50 soldiers, and just one little old prophet, and here's these 50 soldiers. But you see, the one little old prophet's got God. He's speaking for God. So he's got the real God, not just some fanciful god of Ekron, the Lord of the Flies. This is the real deal. He's got the real God that made heaven and earth, backing him up. And so here come these 50. Thou man of God, the king hath said, Come down. And Elijah answered and said to the captain of the 50, If I be a man of God, see, he called him that. If I be a man of God, then let fire come down from heaven and consume thee and thy 50. And there came down fire from heaven and consumed him and his 50. How about that? Yeah. Now, I wonder if that soldier, if there might have been a little bit of sarcasm in his voice when he said, Oh, man of God, okay, if I'm a man of God, then let fire come down and consume. And fire came down. Did I read that right? And it didn't say fire came up from hell. It said fire came down from heaven. Is that right? Yeah. Let fire come down from heaven. And fire came down from heaven. Who lives in heaven? God does. This wasn't the devil. This was God. God did it. And why would God send down fire from heaven and consume him and his 50? Well, this was the judgment of God. This was God's wrath in action, if you want to say it that way. This is what a perfect, vivid illustration of what many people think God is still doing. And the reason they think that is they think God is still doing this kind of thing. Now, it might not be fire from heaven. Maybe it's a hurricane. Maybe it's 9/11. Maybe it's... Now, here's where it gets a little pointed. When things happen in our lives, the first thing we're tempted to think, what did I do wrong? But I'm here to tell you, well, on the one hand, you didn't do anything wrong specifically, but on the other hand, there could be lots of things we've done wrong. But here's the answer to that. The implied question is, what did I do wrong to cause God to send this into my life? And my answer to you is, God did not send anything bad into your life. Now, this happened. This did happen, and we read about it here in the Old Testament. But let's turn over to Luke's Gospel in chapter 9 just for a second. And we have something that updates the situation and gives us something to ponder. Verse 51. Luke's Gospel, chapter 9, verse 51. This is now talking about Jesus. It came to pass, verse 51 says, when the time was come that he should be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers before his face. And they went and entered into the village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. Now remember what I just told you. The Samaritans are the descendants that we're reading about here, are the descendants of those people that we just read about back in 2 Kings, that established their own rival temple there, of whose king we just read about. So now Jesus is traveling, and it says he set his face as though he would go to Jerusalem. Now remember, Jerusalem is in the south, in Judah. But he's going to pass through Samaria, and he's sent into a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. Verse 53 says, they did not receive him, because his face was as though he would go to Jerusalem. Why did they not receive him? Because they were jealous, and there was hostility. It was sort of like they're saying, oh, well, if you're going to Jerusalem, then just forget it. We're not going to have anything to do with you. Now, ordinarily, most people, that would make them a little bit unhappy. That would make me a little bit unhappy, right? You can understand how that might make you a little bit upset. Oh, well, if you're going over there, then I won't give you you can't stay here. We won't give you a place to stay. It inconvenienced Jesus and his disciples, and it made them mad. And here's how we know. Verse 54 said, when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, even as Elias did? Elias is a Greek version of Elijah. You know what they're talking about, don't you? We just read about it. as good students of the Scripture as they were. And